Hey, hi everyone. Happy Thursday. We're at 2 o'clock, so we will start our webinar. I'm Kelly G. Loeb, your host, and I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator. Thank you all for being here. Today we have a presentation from Dr. John Thyfault, who has research expertise in metabolism, mitochondrial energetics, obesity, and exercise physiology using translational approaches in animal models and human subjects. Pretty exciting. The broad theme of his research focuses on the mechanisms by which exercise, physical activity, and aerobic capacity reduce susceptibility for obesity, chronic metabolic disease, states of insulin resistance and fatty liver, and neurometabolic deficits associated with aging. Dr. Thyfault is a professor at the KU Medical Center in the Department of Cellular Biology and Physiology and the Department of Internal Medicine Division of Endocrinology. He is also a research scientist at the KCVA Medical Center in Kansas City. So all of that is to say he knows his stuff, and we are in for a good talk today about physical activity for healthy aging. So I will turn it over to Dr. Thyfault in just a moment with some reminders to keep yourselves on mute, please. Use the chat if you have questions or comments. We are recording, so this recording will be available after today's meeting, most likely tomorrow. And we are excited to hear from our presenter. So with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen and welcome Dr. Thyfault, and you are in charge now. Thank you so much.
All right. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. All right. I'm loading my screen. Let's give it a second and then let me know if you see it. All right. Can everyone see it? Okay. Hello. So I'm very excited to present to you today. A little bit of background. I'm originally from Western Kansas. I grew up north of Hayes in Plainville, and the same hometown as Jerry Moran. And I went to Fort Hays for my undergrad and master's, and then I went to KU for my PhD, and I did a postdoc in North Carolina, and then 10 years at Missouri. And about 8 years ago, I came back to Kansas here at KU Med. And one of the main reasons I came to KU Med was to take part in the exciting work going on in the Alzheimer's Disease Center. As you probably heard from the description of my background, I've mostly been working on obesity, diabetes, fatty liver, metabolic diseases. But as time goes on, there's more and more connections between those conditions and early cognitive decline and brain health issues with aging. And so I've sort of been moving into that area, trying to bring my expertise and how the rest of the body works in terms of metabolism into interactions with brain health. I'm a part of quite a few studies right now looking at brain health. I don't have a lot of data directly on brain health today, so I thought I'd try to go over a few concepts related to exercise, physical activity, and fitness, and talk to you about that and how it affects our health. And at the end, I'll go over a little bit of data related to an Alzheimer's project that we concluded a couple of years ago. So my lab, we came up with a branding term for our lab. We call ourselves the Tempo Lab, Translational Exercise, Metabolic Physiology, Obesity Lab. And we are very much interested in studying the connections between obesity, low fitness, the hypercaloric environment we live in, and inactivity and how that drives metabolic diseases. And as was indicated, we use studies that are extend from human research to animal models to stuff that we do in cell culture models. So first of all, I just want to give a little background on what physical activity and exercise means overall. So and I should have mentioned that my PhD is actually in exercise physiology, and my whole life I've been very fascinated with exercise. It started with being an athlete, and then it moved into seeing all the health problems that my family was having and wondering if more exercise or activity would be beneficial for that. So I first want you to think about how we spend our daily life. We're either we're doing sedentary behaviors like right now, where we're staring at a screen, or we have light intensity activities where we move around, ambulate to do functions of daily living. Or sometimes we have moderate to vigorous activities, and that can be walking down the street to see your neighbor or doing something in the yard, of course, but it can also be planned exercise where you say, okay, I'm going to go out, I'm going to do 20 or 30 minutes of planned exercise. So if you think about this, our day is really broken up into where we probably spend about 60% of our time being sedentary. And when we say sedentary, that means sitting time. We spend about 35% of our time having light activity, and we really only spend about 5% of our time having moderate to vigorous physical activity. So if you break that down here, looking at this pie chart, you can see that most of our day is not doing vigorous physical activity, right? Most of it's this light activity and this sedentary time. So there's been a lot of work over the last 10, 15 years posing the question, if we're going to intervene in making more people more active, maybe we should be intervening in the sedentary time and the light activity time, because it's easy and it's tolerable. It's an easier thing to change. It's the bigger volume of the day to change. But at the same time, we also can't forget how important moderate to vigorous physical activity is for our health as well. And I'm going to explain that a little bit more as we go along. And again, that means activity that's more on the higher end. It doesn't mean running or sprinting. It could just mean walking at a steady pace on a road. So let's put this into a little bit more context here. This is a slide that was made a few years ago with a manuscript I was a part of, trying to look at compare sedentary time and physical activity. And what this author was trying to do, what this author was trying to do was to compare how physically active lifestyles compare to maybe physically inactive lifestyles. So what we have here is, first of all, let's look at step counts per day. Everyone's probably worn a pedometer at some point. It just measures how many steps you take during a day. And I try to really push this as the easiest way to capture how active you're being. It's really a simple and easy way. It can be measured on your phone. It can be measured on really fancy smartwatches, but you can also just buy very simple pedometers that you wear in your belt or on your arm. And so it's generally believed that if you get less than 5,000 steps a day, you probably are living more of a sedentary lifestyle, in that more of your day is being spent sitting down, because it would impact that you have less steps. If you're below 7,500 steps a day, that would be considered still probably in a more physically inactive lifestyle. But if you're above 7,500 steps a day, that would mean that you're more physically active. So it's kind of a paradigm from low to high in terms of how much you move. Now, if you are someone that gets 7,500 steps a day, there's a pretty good chance that you're getting your moderate to vigorous programmed exercise levels. The government recommends that we get 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week, right? You've all heard that lots of times. So that would be 150 minutes a week. If you get the 7,500 steps a day, it's probably very likely that you're walking for 10 to 15, 20-minute periods of time to get to that level. And so you're getting that level of MVPA. Likewise, if you go out and say, hey, every day I'm going to do 30 minutes of walking or 40 minutes of walking, or I'm going to go do something that's active, it's very likely that you're going to get your 7,500 steps a day. So these things kind of are interlinked. So that's why having 7,500 steps a day or more probably means that you're getting your government guidelines for physical activity and you're being more active. Now, when we also talk about sedentary time, which again is what we really quantify as sitting, it's distinct from activity, but it kind of interacts, right? And what we're learning over time is that the duration of each sitting bout can have harmful effects on your health. So if you sit for 2-hour periods at a time, and then these orange parts are when you stand up and move around, doing longer sitting duration could be harmful for your health compared to breaking up your sitting time a lot during the day. And so there's actually lots of companies now that have on the company computers, the computer will either shut down or will have something like that says stand up or move around, or your smartwatches like the one I'm wearing will alert me if I've been sitting too long and kind of tell me I should stand up and move around. And that's where this comes from, is from this research. And so, of course, if you're on the lower end of the spectrum here, you're going to have a lower energy expenditure, and that's going to affect potentially your risk for weight gain as you get older. There's also big implications for how strong you are, how able you are to get up and move around throughout the day, and basically your overall physical function. The more you're on this end of the spectrum, the longer you're going to maintain that physical function. Now, what's unfortunate is that the average American only gets 5,000 steps a day. So we're basically, as a society, we're all pretty inactive. And when I was younger, I used to think, well, I used to poo-poo that a lot, be like, why aren't people more active? But as I've gotten older, and I'm so busy with my job and my life and my kids, it is hard for me to always get over 7,500 steps a day as well. So it's really kind of a societal issue that we have with our modern environment. All right. I can't get the slide to advance. There we go. Okay, so why do we care so much about how active we are or how much time we spend sitting? Well, the reason why is that these outcome measures are tightly linked to our risk for mortality and disease. So let me take you through this slide. This is a slide where they put relative risk for all-cause mortality on this axis. So the higher you go on this axis, the more risk you have for all-cause mortality. And then on the bottom axis, what they're doing is they're taking three different outcome measures of health and fitness. One is how much you sit during the day, and that goes from more sitting on the left to less sitting on the right. The other one is fitness, which we haven't talked about yet, but we're going to get into that. And we call that cardiorespiratory fitness. Again, we're looking at low fitness on the left, high fitness on the right. And then the last variable they're quantifying here, or they're comparing here, is moderate activity. And so on the left would be low active, on the right would be very high active. And what you can appreciate is if you go from lots of sitting, very low activity, and low fitness, if you shift across to the right and you improve those outcome variables, your risk for all-cause mortality goes down dramatically. And what's most astounding is these are just moderate changes. If you can see, the biggest slope is from low to moderate. That's where the biggest protection is. When you go further than that, you still get some more protection, but it's nowhere near as powerful as going from these low areas to these high or moderate areas. So spend less time sitting, be more active, have higher fitness. And what's cool is these three variables are all shown to be tied to fitness, or to be tied to risk for mortality independently, meaning they're individually linked to this outcome measure. What's also interesting is in these large studies, this study, they pulled data from over 100,000 people. These factors did this independently of body weight or obesity status, and a bunch of other variables, including smoking and different things like that. So it's a very powerful link here. So one of the first studies that really looked at specifically fitness was this study from Steve Blair. And Steve Blair is actually a small town Kansas guy. I can't even remember what town he's from. It's near the Nebraska border. But he is one of the most famous epidemiologists or scientists in the world at looking at the relationship between fitness and health. And he worked down at the Cooper Clinic in Texas, where if you're not familiar with the Cooper Clinic, does anyone remember Ken Cooper and that jogging book that came out in the 70s? I think it was called Aerobics Jogging or something like that. And it was kind of the reason that Nikes were, the first Nike shoes were developed was because of this jogging thing that occurred in the 70s. So Ken Cooper was this cardiologist, and really rich people in Dallas would go to him to make sure that they were fit and healthy. And so they would do exercise tests to measure their fitness in these people, and then they would track them over time. and then they would record when there were deaths with these patients. And what they found was this huge effect, both in women and men, that the people with the lowest cardiorespiratory fitness had the highest risk for mortality, and the people with the highest fitness had the lowest risk. And then you could see this moderate group had this huge effect in both men and women. And they actually found that this was independent of obesity status, which led to this term of fit but fat, or fat but fit. And I think Dr. Blair liked that term himself because he's kind of a chubby guy like a lot of us. And he liked the idea that you could be fit and overcome any kind of health risk with being slightly overweight. So let's talk about this a little bit more. So how do we measure this variable? We call it a number of different things. One thing we call it is aerobic capacity. It's also called fitness. Scientifically, we often call it, I'm gonna do this. Trying to get rid of this thing at the top of my screen. Okay. Scientifically, we often call it VO2 max, which stands for volume of oxygen utilized during exercise, during max exercise. So volume of oxygen max. And how we test it is that you put someone on a treadmill or a bike and you start them off at a low intensity exercise. And every 2 or 3 minutes, you increase the intensity until they get to a point where they can no longer go any further. And you actually measure oxygen consumption with a device like this during the test. And you can see that at some point they can't go any further, and there's no further increase in their oxygen consumption at the whole body level. And that's why we call it VO2 max. And the systems in your body that go into this VO2 max are almost every tissue in the body plays a role. So you have your lungs, your cardiovascular system, your skeletal muscle system that's doing the work. But it really doesn't stop there. Your brain's highly involved metabolically during this. All of the neural tissues in your body, even your bones get activated during exercise. There's all kinds of things occurring that allow for this to happen during exercise, for this rapid increase in oxygen consumption. So the next thing I want to talk about is, how does being active affect your aerobic capacity, your VO2 max, or your fitness? And so here you can see a cross-sectional study where they looked at people from different ages on this axis. This is 10 years old up to 80 years old. And here they looked at aerobic capacity, and they noticed that people who were sedentary had much lower VO2 maxes in their young life compared to people who were aerobically trained. But what you can appreciate is that both groups, as we age, unfortunately, our aerobic capacity goes down, okay, over time. But what you can take from this is, if we can get it higher at a young age and get it at a greater peak, then you'll be protected, so that at older ages of 50 and above, you still have much higher levels than the groups that were sedentary when they were young. Now, the good news is you can start exercising at any time in life and improve your VO2 max or improve your fitness. So you can go from this low fit group and improve your fitness by being more active. There is a frailty threshold where you get a aerobic fitness value that's so low that you no longer can do activities of normal life. And that what you can see here is that if you're active throughout your life, there's a chance that you'd have about a 30-year difference of reaching that threshold between these two groups. So here's that same slide again, okay? And all I wanted to do is to show you kind of the heterogeneity or the differences in this, how much oxygen can be consumed during exercise. So this table shows males here and females here. And cross-country skiers are known to have the highest fitness of anyone in the world because of the way that their whole body is used during that exercise. So they're in the 80s and 70s. Distance runners are 75 and 60. And then sedentary young people are about 45 and 38. And then sedentary more middle age, you can see, are 35 and 30. People that have a myocardial infarction or a heart attack are pretty low here, 22 and 18. And then people with COPD are very, very low. And so this just kind of gives you a range of how a high level athlete versus kind of an average younger person versus middle age of what a VO2 max looks like. So there was this really cool study done in the 60s back, and it was really done for NASA when they were really interested in what space flight would do to our health. And of course, when astronauts go up into space, there's zero gravity. So they would do bed rest studies to try to mimic what happens with zero gravity. And there's a reason why I'm showing you this data, okay? So they took these young people, these young men, and they measured their VO2 max in 1966. And then they forced them to lay in bed for 30 days to try to, and they call it bed rest studies, to try to induce what might happen if our astronauts went to the moon or to space and didn't have gravity for 30 days. And what you could see is this massive decrease in VO2 max that happened in these individuals with bed rest. Now you can easily apply this to your friends or your family who maybe have health issues where they have to be hospitalized and lay in bed for a long duration of time. It has a big effect on our fitness. And thankfully, a lot of hospitals have adapted and now really try to get people out of bed daily to avoid this loss of fitness. So then what they did was they asked these people 30 years later in 1996 to come back and to have fitness tests done again. So here was their baseline in 66, here was after bed rest, and then they had them come back in 1996. And what you can see is that 30 days of bed rest cause a bigger reduction in fitness than 30 years of aging. So what we do on a daily basis and how much we move really can impact the maintenance of VO2 max and our VO2 max levels over time. So just a couple more things I want to highlight here is that when we look at what affects VO2 max, there's a lot of heterogeneity. Not everyone is the same. So if you take a whole bunch of sedentary people that hardly move at all, you'll still have some that have higher VO2 max than others. And that's the kind of the intrinsic or genetic component of it. And then if you look at people after they exercise, you have different responders. Some respond with greater VO2 max or fitness changes, and some respond with lower changes. So this is an example of that. So in one study, they recruited men that were aged 17 to 35, and they all reported being very inactive and sedentary. The VO2 max average was 41, but about 7% of those were very low, and about 7% of those men had very high fitness, just to show you how much variability there is. Then there was another study where they looked at how well people respond to exercise. So they took people that were sedentary and they did a 6-month exercise trial where people would come into the lab and exercise 5 days a week at a pretty high intensity. So that's a lot of training. And they found that the average increase in VO2 max was 16%, but 20% of people were really high responders to improvement and 20% were really low responders. So again, you have a lot of heterogeneity and variability in your fitness and at baseline and how you respond to exercise. And we really don't completely understand that, and more work needs to be done in that area. So why do I keep talking about fitness so much? Well, yeah, I already showed you that low fitness was linked, or low aerobic capacity was linked to risk for mortality, but it's also been independently linked to a number of disease states. It's been linked to Alzheimer's disease. It's been linked to metabolic syndrome, fatty liver, cardiovascular disease, risk for stroke, risk for type 2 diabetes. And then in the cancers, it's specifically linked to breast cancer and colon cancer. It's been also linked to dementia and PCOS. So if you do a maximal exercise test and you can only go this far, your risk for all these diseases is much higher than someone who can go further on the test. Okay, so when we exercise and we bring in all that oxygen, our muscles are doing the physical work, right? They're contracting and they're allowing us to work. So a lot of that oxygen that's coming into the body is being consumed in the muscle itself. And the muscle has these little organelles called mitochondria. Everyone learns in grade school that the mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell. So it makes sense that the higher your aerobic capacity, the more mitochondria or oxygen consuming powerhouses of the cell you would have in your muscle. And lo and behold, that has been shown in a lot of studies over the years. This is in different populations. So this is fitness on this axis versus how much mitochondria is in your muscle in younger individuals, in lean and obese individuals, and then in individuals that are older. Across all this span, you see this relationship between more mitochondria in your muscle, those powerhouses of the cell that create the energy, that use the oxygen to create the energy, and your aerobic capacity. And the reason that I have this gentleman on here, his name was Bengt Saltin, very famous Swedish scientist who did a lot of this work in the 60s, 70s, 80s. So I want to give him a little credit for a lot of this work. So now I'm going to talk about an animal model real quick. This is an animal model that our lab has used a lot over the years. And the whole reason this animal model was created was all of this data out there showing that fitness impacted human health. We didn't really know mechanisms. So a gentleman named Dr. Steve Britton, he was upset that there wasn't a good way to study how fitness impacts health. So what he decided to do was take rats, a mixed strain of rats, run them on a treadmill to exhaustion. And then he would take the top 10% of the runners, the best runners, and breed them together. And he took the bottom 10%, the worst runners, and breed them together. And then he did that for generation after generation after generation. So by generation 11 here's the different generations. You can see these animals in these open circles were able to run much further before they reached exhaustion than these runners, than the lower group. So he coined these high capacity runners, or HCR, and low capacity runners, LCR. And they actually did VO2 max tests in these rats, and they found a 30 to 40% difference in their VO2 max. So this is the HCR VO2 max and the LCR VO2 max. So then what he did in these animals is he published a really cool paper showing that the low capacity runners had cardiovascular risk factors and lower mitochondrial content and a whole bunch of other negative health outcomes, even at a younger age. And they went on to show that if they studied these animals and did basically longevity studies, which means you just see how long they live, that the HCR rats the high fit rats lived about 6 months longer than the LCRs. And they did this in a study at Michigan, and they did this in a study at Trondheim, Norway. So at 2 different places, and found the same result. So to me, this is very fascinating because you had epidemiology research collected in human subjects that suggested that fitness impacted longevity and risk for disease. So you create an animal model to kind of replicate that, and you get the same outcome, that these animals have different longevity. To me, it's really fascinating. So we use this animal model a lot to study risk for fatty liver, but we're now using this model to study brain health with aging. So and I don't have a lot of new data to show you, but we're doing a lot of work on this right now. So the last thing I want to talk about is one study that we did looking at Alzheimer's and skeletal muscle metabolism in Alzheimer's, okay? And it's based on this whole association between aerobic capacity and health. So I'm sure a lot of you know the different scientists at the KU ADRC, but Dr. Russ Swerdlow has been famous for quite a while in terms of highlighting that Alzheimer's disease is probably a mitochondrial energy disease, and that there's some kind of deficit in the ability to make energy in the brain and maybe in the body that precedes the development of Alzheimer's disease. And what we have known for a long time is that if we look at brain scans, which are measuring glucose metabolism in the brain, that there's signs of less glucose metabolism highlighted by less glow here in the brain in people with early Alzheimer's versus normal. And as the disease progresses, there's less glucose metabolism. So overall, this would suggest that Alzheimer's is linked to an energy deficit in the brain, or the inability to use energy. Dr. Jill Morris is another scientist who trained under Dr. Swerdlow and Dr. Burns, and now runs her own laboratory. And she's found that also people with mild cognitive impairment, or AD, have lower insulin sensitivity in the whole body. And this is basically looking at glucose utilization in the whole body, not just the brain, but the whole body, and that there's lower glucose utilization, again, suggesting there's a whole body energetic deficit occurring. And her and her colleagues have also shown that aerobic capacity is lower with people with mild cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's. So to us, you know, a lot of people are focused on brain metabolism, but these two pieces of data suggest that muscle metabolism, where those mitochondria are that really fuel metabolism during exercise and really fuel glucose metabolism, may be altered with mild cognitive impairment or AD. But no one had really explored skeletal muscle metabolism. And I want to highlight that muscles make up about 40% of our whole body and are a huge part of our metabolism at the whole body level. So they had, the Alzheimer's Center here had shown that there was, when they did an exercise intervention, that what they found was that if people in the exercise intervention had an increase in VO2 max is on the bottom here, that if they had an increase in VO2 max, they tended to have an increase in memory with the exercise intervention, and they tended to have an increase in hippocampal volume. So these are two outcome measures of brain health. And it was showed that if again, I want to highlight, if you do aerobic exercise and you're able to improve your aerobic fitness or your fitness, that there was evidence that it can improve your brain health. But we again wanted to focus on muscle and ask the question, do non-brain targets affect AD susceptibility? And is there a decrement or some kind of dysfunction in muscle mitochondria in mild cognitive impairment or Alzheimer's disease? Again, we're looking at the mitochondria within the muscle. So we did a simple cross-sectional design, which means we took people with mild cognitive impairment that have been diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment, and we recruited them to take part in this study. And then we also recruited healthy controls that were the same age, the same body weight, and pretty much had the same lifestyle factors. We had a balanced design with ApoE4 carriers versus non-carriers in both groups. We took skeletal muscle biopsies from the thigh. So these are very small little muscle biopsies. We just go beneath the skin, take a very small piece of muscle out, and we can take that back to the lab and we can measure how well the mitochondria work in the muscle. We also measured their physical activity via accelerometry to make sure that there wasn't big differences in physical activity. And we just simply recorded what drugs they were on. And it turned out a lot of these people in the MCI group were on a class of drugs called cholinesterase inhibitors. And I'll talk about that more in a second. This study was led by myself and Jill Morris, and then Dr. Colin McCohen in the lab did all of the muscle analysis. So I want to make sure to give him credit. This is a really busy slide, but this is our subject characteristics. So we ended up breaking our groups into three. This is our control group. This is our people with MCI that were not taking donepezil or drugs. And this is our group with MCI that were taking meds for their condition. You can see here, if we look at VO2 max or VO2 peak, we did have a little bit of a decline, but it wasn't significant across our three groups. There wasn't a huge difference in VO2 max across our three groups. So here's what we found in the muscle. So this is much like the whole body VO2 max measurement I was talking to you about. This is basically measuring oxygen consumption in the muscle itself. We actually feed it nutrients and we measure how much oxygen it consumes. And that, as I said before, that correlates very well with whole body oxygen consumption, typically. And so what we see here is that here's the cognitively healthy, our controls. Here is the individuals diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment. You can see there is a big drop in mitochondrial function in their muscle. However, if they were on this drug donepezil, which is commonly used to try to slow cognitive decline, they had normal mitochondrial function in their muscle, which we're trying to follow up on this and understand what it means. So the things that come out of this are the following. There's more and more evidence suggesting that there is metabolism or energetic defects that lead to Alzheimer's disease in the brain, but there's also more and more evidence that it could be in the peripheral tissues like muscle that play such an important role in our health. And if we can exercise more, improve our fitness, maintain mitochondrial function, maybe we can offset these declines that occur and maybe that impact brain health. Okay, last thing is I just want to really highlight, it used to be thought that exercise really only impacted the cardiovascular system and the muscles, but it's now known that exercise impacts lots of other things. In fact, I don't even have the brain on this graph, but there's other tissues throughout the body that exercise affects positively, including the pancreas, the liver, our vascular system, muscle, and our adipose tissue. And all these effects lead to improvements in whole body outcome measures, including aerobic capacity. And it's been linked to improving health and lowering risk for all these different diseases. And I really think that all of these peripheral adaptations and all these different organ systems help keep the brain healthy as we age. So that's all I have to present today. Here's my email and my Twitter handle, and I'm open for questions if we're doing questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thyfault. There is a question in the chat from Richards, and Richards writes, pedometers count steps but not intensity. How can one account for interval training or hiking hills which might not get to 7,500 steps?
Okay, so that's a great question. So yes, if you do higher intensity type exercise, the guidelines say that then you need less volume during the day. So he's right that you can't count for that with your pedometer, but you can just know that, hey, when I am active, if I'm doing more vigorous stuff, but I'm not quite reading that step count, that's okay.
Okay. Great. Well, I know that's encouraging, and I know that a lot of us are looking at our step trackers. I know I am. I'll just speak for me. I'm looking at my step tracker for the day, and I'm also very charmed by your slide about rats on treadmills. I think that's pretty motivating.
I also have a question.
Amy's got a question. Go ahead, Amy. Nope, I think you muted yourself again, Amy. If you want to unmute, you can. And then Lloyd's got a question in the chat, which is better, the cycle machine, treadmill, or elliptical? And then we'll come back to you, Amy.
It's just your preference. There's not one that's better. It's really just picking one that you like to do the most, or if if it's advantageous to kind of cycle through them and try different ones so you can get a higher volume, that's fine too. There definitely is like a little bit more balance involved in the treadmill, and there's some people who think that treadmill walking probably helps keep your coordination and motor skills stronger as you age, where an elliptical kind of guides your legs for you, and a bike kind of locks you into a machine. So treadmill probably ultimately may be better to offset effects of aging, but really it's just choosing whatever you like to do the most. And I would vary it up, because if you do too much of any of them, sometimes you can get some injuries, overuse injuries. By changing them up, that way you can avoid that.
Cool.
Thank you for the chance to ask the question. I was on one of your talks prior, and you all had recommended creatine monohydrate. I have muscular mitochondrial dystrophy, and I wonder if there's additional supplements outside of prescriptions that you might recommend to help my energy. I'm trying to exercise, but was diagnosed in '95 and just having a hard time keeping up.
Right. Well, I'm sorry about that, first of all. I would try creatine. It's like the one supplement that's ever been shown to be really, it actually has positive effects. The supplement industry pushes a lot of stuff that doesn't do anything, but creatine actually will improve your energy metabolism in your muscle.
How high can I go with that? I'm taking 2 teaspoons now. I don't remember how that translates, but
I think it's 5 grams a day is kind of
Yeah.
what is kind of the max. If you go above that, it doesn't do any good.
okay.
And I think that's probably 2 teaspoons.
And do it like in the morning,
Yeah, you can
And-
do it in the morning.
monohydrate, but nothing else that you might say to add to it, since I've been doing that since our last talk.
No, I mean, do you get enough glucose in your, and like enough carbohydrates in your diet? Do you eat like a normal American diet?
I just eat like the organic vegetables. I do have to kind of watch my blood sugar. It spikes a bit. My mom has type 2 diabetes.
Okay,
But
okay.
I eat healthy and no
Yeah, you don't
sweets.
avoid carbohydrates though, right?
No, I don't.
Okay. Then I really don't have any other recommendations for you. I could tell you some stuff, but I want to make sure I only say things I know would have a positive effect. So I'm sorry, there's nothing else I can think of.
Thank you.
John, can you go back one screen, please?
Uh-huh.
Okay, we're
Thank you.
over time already, and I know that everybody's really appreciative of your information today, Dr. Thyfault. There are a couple more questions in the chat. One is, are you currently doing any research? And the other is cardio or strength training better?
So I am doing a research study now. We just finished enrolling though, but we hope Dr. Jill Morris is doing studies that I'm involved with. So you could reach out and talk to her about her studies, and they're focused on exercise, and we will have more doing in the future. And then both cardio and strength training are both very positive. They both can improve your health, but they kind of do it in different ways. So if you can do both of them together, you'll get the ultimate best bang for your buck. Yeah, and I'm sorry I went longer than I was supposed to. I always talk too much on my slides.
As someone who does the same, I relate, and I think we all appreciate your willingness to share your information and be so generous with your time. So thank you from all of us. Everybody, this will be available as a recording if you want to go back and get any more information. And then Dr. Thyfault has been very kind to share his contact information. So if you needed that, I hope you got it from the slide, or we can put you in touch. We'll be back next Thursday. Next week, our topic is, fittingly, why research participation is so important. So if you've gotten the bug for, oh, maybe I should get in a study, you can come back next Thursday and hear more from Eric Vidoni about why that is so important. And we will send a reminder, as always, to your email with the topic and the link for the Zoom, as well as the My Alliance newsletter. So thanks everybody for being here. Thank you again to Dr. Thyfault. We appreciate you and your expertise. And everybody have a great afternoon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.